Welcome everybody to this latest seminar in the series on official history, past, present and future. It's good to see some new and some familiar faces, or at least names, joining us tonight. I'm Richard Smith and I'm a historian at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and I'm chairing tonight's session entitled The Institutional Meets the Personal, Official Historians and Memoirs of Public Servants, hosted as ever with history and policy at the IHR. Before we go on, I just wanted to give a quick plug for our next seminar, which is on the 5th of June, where we'll have two papers, one looking at official histories of the end of empire, and the other looking at war diaries, whether they're the first rough draft of official history or counter history. So do join us for that on the 5th of June. But back to tonight, and we've got a two-part paper tonight looking at the relationship between official history and autobiographical writing by public servants. And first we're going to hear from Professor Helen McCarthy, historian of modern Britain at the University of Cambridge. She's published on the role of women in British diplomatic culture, the history of working motherhood, and is currently researching the social and cultural history of retirement since 1945. And then we're going to hear from Dennis Grube, who is Professor of Politics and Public Policy, also at the University of Cambridge. His research and publications focuses on political and administrative history, the Westminster system of government, the processes of public policy decision-making, and institutional memory. We're going to hear both papers and then take questions at the end, so feel free to put any questions you have in the chat at any time. Can I just remind everybody to please remain muted until you perhaps want to come in later to ask a question. And just to say that the session is being recorded and will eventually be posted on the History and Policy website. So without further ado, my great pleasure to call on Helen to kick us off. Helen, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and hello everyone. It's lovely to be part of this series, and I think that my screen now should be shared, and someone can jump in and tell me if there are any technical hitches.
We can see it, Helen. Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, so as Richard indicated, we're going to do this as a two-hander, starting with me for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Dennis for the same. So the idea for this panel springs from our mutual interests in the institutional cultures of government bureaucracies, and especially in the individuals who are employed within them. I come at this subject as a historian who's worked quite a bit on the British civil service as an employer and a workplace, and especially on the Foreign Office, which will be my main focus today. Dennis's research is more contemporary and comparative and policy focused, although he is a historian by training and is very much engaged in thinking about the intersections of history and political science, which of course makes him a dream collaborator for a panel of this kind. Dennis and I got chatting about the relationship between institutional memory, storytelling, history writing, and record keeping, and soon discovered a shared fascination with what I like to think of as an artifact in which all of these things interconnect, namely the memoirs of public servants. These are texts that I have turned to frequently to help me reconstruct the institutional worlds of British diplomats and officials, whilst Dennis has explored them as purposeful interventions into sometimes quite heated public debates, what he has called reminiscing in public. When I saw the call for papers for this series on official histories, it got me reflecting upon the relationship between historical writing about government and autobiographical writing by public servants. Some of the objectives of the two genres might be said to be held in common: documenting the evolution of an institution over time, explaining the contexts for and reasons behind policy decisions, drawing out lessons for the future. Yet, in other respects, the optic and evidence base employed in these genres radically diverge. Where the official historian performs detachment and generalized authority, the public memoirist claims the authenticity of the participant and eyewitness. Where the official historian worships official documents, the writer of autobiography prizes memory, sometimes aided by private diaries and letters. Furthermore, the terms on which official histories are written are set by government, whereas efforts since the 1970s to regulate the publication of memoirs in the interests of protecting secrecy and ministerial trust have, I think it's fair to say, proved largely ineffective. In recent decades, a handful of former officials have become well-known authors, commanding large advances and lucrative serializations. So where does all of this leave the official historian? Well, Dennis is going to offer his own set of answers to that question. But in the time that I have, I'm going to do three things, focused, as I suggested, on the diplomatic memoir. So first, say something about the diplomatic memoir as a form of historical writing about government and politics. Then I'll pivot and talk about the diplomatic memoir and its shadow genre, the spousal memoir, as a window onto the social and cultural history of government. And finally, I'll conclude briefly by suggesting that these texts are best understood as para-histories, which ultimately share the legitimizing objectives of official histories, rather than counter-histories, which serve to disrupt and displace, and which I know you're going to be talking about next time. Okay, so I'm going to start then with the diplomatic memoir as a form of historical writing about government. And it might be useful to start off with a bit of a list. And I apologize for the size of the font here, but I wanted to get as many titles onto the slide as possible. This by no means comprehensively maps the genre, but it gives you some sense of the body of work that I'm talking about. I wouldn't wish to hazard a guess as to when the very first diplomatic memoir was penned. As a form of life writing, autobiography has, of course, a very long history, which I won't go into now, except to note its pluralistic traditions and porous edges. Diplomatic memoir shares ground with political memoir, with travel writing, with current affairs journalism. It's also closely related to autobiographical writing by colonial officers and by military men and by spies and also by British council employees. And some of what I'm going to say about diplomats may carry over quite nicely into those related genres, or it might not, and that could be something interesting to talk about. So here then is a list of published autobiographical works by individuals who were employed in the diplomatic service or the Foreign Office, which of course were two separate things before the First World War. This list is not, as I say, exhaustive, and so I'd be cautious about drawing too many firm conclusions from it. But I think it's possible to identify something of a lull in the post-war decades, and then a notable uptick in memoir writing in the later 20th century and early 21st. And of course, much of this reflects commercial publishing dynamics. There was a moment around the publication of Meyer's DC Confidential, followed by Cooper Coles's two books and Jeremy Greenstock's book on Iraq, when memoirs by diplomats seemed to be quite popular. I don't have sales figures. I suspect that diplomatic memoirs on the whole rank below the memoirs of politicians in terms of visibility and readership. The historian Richard Toy has a nice phrase, which I will deploy here. He refers to the political celebrity industrial complex to describe the close relationship between publishing, the media, and politics. And he notes how within this complex, some political lives claim greater stature than others. And this hierarchy is definitely reflected in diplomatic memoir publishing. The books that are published by the major trade presses, which one sees in the windows at Waterstones, tend to be written by officials who've held the weightiest or most high-profile posts, most of whom are white men. Ambassadors to the US, such as Meyer, ambassadors who were participants at major moments of conflict, such as Greenstock, are perhaps understandably more attractive to publishers than those with less illustrious or eventful careers. The latter group might find a home with smaller, more specialist presses. An outfit called Radcliffe Press published quite a few of those 1990s titles on my slide, although it now seems to have gone into abeyance. If anyone can tell me about the Radcliffe Press, please do. And then to complete this picture, we must acknowledge the unknown number of unpublished memoirs. I count 9 of these in the British Diplomatic Oral History Programme collection at Churchill College. This, as the name suggests, is primarily a bank of oral history interviews. But some of the diplomats have also donated written memoirs as a supplement to, or in some cases, in lieu of an interview. And of course, there are interesting methodological questions about the differences between oral reminiscences and written ones, but I won't digress into that now.
Helen, sorry, Helen, can I interrupt? You were still on your title slide. Would it be possible just to move?
Really? Oh, that's strange. It's moving forward on my screen.
Are you seeing something different? What we've got is we're not in slideshow mode. I don't think. Maybe that's the problem.
Okay, let me try again.
Sorry about that.
Can you see it now?
Yep, it's up now. That's great.
You can see the list, my great long list?
We can, yes. We're all very keen to see it.
I'll just give you 20 seconds then to just have a little look at that. As I said, this is not an exhaustive list. This was me just trying to put as much as I could find on a slide. And I'm sure that there are titles that should be there that aren't there. But this is just to give you a sort of a rough sense of, as I say, the body of work that I'm talking about. So, okay, I might just keep it like this. Okay, so why do diplomats write memoirs, and in what ways might these texts share ground with official history? And I think the answers to those questions are interrelated. So what comes across in many of the texts written by officials who have reached the highest ranks is a sense of wishing to bear witness to important historical events. Their authority to speak rests not on having seen all the documents, like the official historian, but rather the fact of having been on the spot. So Greenstock is quite explicit in his book about Iraq that he's not doing historical research, but offering my account of things as I see them. One individual's view of events for historians to make use of as they see fit, and for readers to gain a more intimate and, I hope, understandable picture. Simon MacDonald expresses a similar idea in the opening to his 2022 book, Leadership, using the metaphor of ascending a mountain and reaching, as head of the diplomatic service, a position not far from the summit. I enjoyed a good view, he writes, so I have written about what I saw on my way to that vantage point. Often that view is as much of people as it is of events. There is a Zelig-like quality to the plate section in Meyer's DC Confidential, in which Sir Christopher seems to be lurking next to every significant political player in recent Anglo-American politics, as well as a celebrity or two. And I apologize for the quality of the images. I took these on my phone, but you can see the effect. You know, here he is next to all of these personalities. And there's a similar effect in the plate section of Ever the Diplomat by Cooper Coles. Here he is with Margaret Thatcher, top right. Here he is with Bobby Kennedy's son, the Congressman Joe Kennedy, bottom left. Here he is with various Foreign Office colleagues. And if we jump further back in time, we find a similar effect in the plate section of Paul Wright's Brittle Glory. Here's the author shaking hands with the Lebanese Prime Minister, sharing a drink with the Lebanese President, chewing the cud with the Congolese President Mobutu, and so on. And I think that what these visual elements are doing in these texts is reinforcing the claim to authority that the authors are making. I can tell you about these great men and their deeds because I was there. Another motivation behind memoir writing by diplomats, is the desire to interpret diplomacy to a general readership. That is to say, to educate and inform a wider public as to what it actually is that diplomats do. So quite a few texts open with statements about how much misunderstanding there is of these subjects and how stereotypes of the rarefied aristocratic Mandarin endure. So 2 examples here from James Reeve and Cooper Coles, both authors expressing a hope that their books will provide a human insight into the working lives of diplomats. Reeve wanting to give a flavour of our life as a blend of work, play and local colour, and Cooper Coles aiming to give the reader a flavour of what diplomats really do and of what being a diplomat actually feels like. And I've added a short passage from Stella Rimington's 2001 memoir because I was struck by how similarly she expresses her goals in writing about the intelligence services. setting out to cast some light on a part of what is called the secret state from a different, more down-to-earth angle than the usual breathless conspiratorial one. So this idea of the memoir as a text which decodes or demystifies or explains the work of the state is, I think, a recurring one, and one which shares some ground with the aims of the official historian. However, in seeking to provide a human insight by privileging the lived experience of the individual, memoirs inevitably adopt an optic which is very different and which, I would suggest, creates more space for the social and cultural dimensions of politics and policymaking. So I'm going to move on now to my second point about memoirs as a form of historical writing. And one could say a great deal about the variety of choices that authors make concerning how much coverage to give to aspects of their personal and private lives. Some memoirs are really proper autobiographies in the sense of starting with I was born, describing childhood and family experiences in some detail. Paul Wright's A Brittle Glory is an example of this. Mark Elliott's unpublished memoir that is held at Churchill College is almost 300 pages long and contains a detailed history of both sides of his family, as well as his childhood and education and so on. Other texts tend to skip quite quickly to the moment of joining the Foreign Office, with the recruitment process and first days in post often described at some length. And there's a good example of the kinds of rich details that memoirs disclose from Richard Talboys, who joined as a late entrant in 1968, aged 36, following a career in accountancy. And this is from his unpublished memoir at Churchill College. And he says, I expected to be put through a lengthy induction course, not a bit of it. I was greeted with words along the lines of, Talboys, yes, you ought to be desk officer for Kenya, Uganda, and the East African Economic Community in East Africa Department. Go away and do it. And there are lots of anecdotal nuggets like this in memoirs, which I think cumulatively build a composite picture of institutional culture, revealing turns of phrases, tacit understandings, pieces of advice handed between diplomats, really the unwritten rules of how the place works. Some texts, rather than spanning a full career, focus on a particular period of time. Meyer talks mostly about his tenure as ambassador in the US, Greenstock in Iraq, and so on. And there's a real range in terms of tone. So Meyer, again, is very gossipy. Greenstock is very sober. Some memoirs give quite a lot of space to richly textured descriptions of places, where there's a crossover there with travel writing. And some say a great deal about their families and especially their wives. And this is a nice segue into my final substantive point, which is about spousal memoirs, of which, again, I'm going to show you a list. And this is not exhaustive. Please let me know if you know of any diplomatic spousal memoirs that ought to be on this list. Rather like the diplomatic memoirs, there appears to be a little flurry of books by wives in the later 20th century and early 21st. And to these, one could again add books by the wives of colonial officers. There were a few, I think, published by the Radcliffe Press again in the 1990s. How far the spousal memoir is a genre of its own is, I think, difficult to say, but they do share some distinctive qualities. Even more so than books by officers, they are evocative of place and of people. They describe the social worlds of diplomacy, to which the authors, as wives of officers, were integral. Right into the late 20th century, there were expectations regarding the active role that spouses would play in hosting and entertaining and accompanying their husbands on formal occasions, as well as sort of looking after children and sorting out housing and the domestic front. By the later 20th century, spousal memoirs become more candid in describing the strains of this role. So Masha Williams, who wrote about going to New York as wife of the deputy consul general in the 1950s, offers a full and revealing account of the stresses of finding accommodation for her family, of organizing a major charity event for the consulate, more or less single-handedly, and always having to be gracious and discreet in conversation at formal events. And there's a lot of interiority in her writing. There's a lot of describing of feelings and emotions and sensations, as this passage suggests. So here she's just arrived in New York with her husband and realizes that now we're in the public eye. And it was as if a weight suddenly pressed down on me, a physical sensation, but there was nothing to be done. I had to live with it. I'm official. I must be strong. And then later, as she's walking down alone Fifth Avenue, trying to find somewhere for her family to live, she describes feeling overwhelmed. On either side, enormous buildings towered over me. They blocked out the sky, pressed down, pinned me in. I felt trapped, dwarfed, and I panicked. Another mode enters the spousal memoir in the early 21st century, which is rather more playful and ironic. And we might glance briefly at the comic illustrations, excuse me, accompanying Cherry Denman's light-hearted book about the trials and tribulations of being a diplomatic wife, published in 2010. Here we have some humorous caricatures of the political officer, cool as a cucumber as he talks about getting diarrhea in Kabul, and the German cultural attaché advocating nudist sunbathing. And then here, perhaps a self-portrait, is the diplomatic wife trying to find a good recipe involving camel testicles, because that's what she's got to work with. So my time is almost up, which is a good thing because I'm beginning a coughing fit. So let me draw things briefly to a close, and by returning to this claim that I made at the start about understanding these texts as para-histories of government and policymaking. And what I mean by this, and what I hope my little survey has indicated, is that ultimately the diplomatic memoir and the spousal memoir share with official history a stabilizing, legitimizing function. One could make the argument that memoirs by officials have more radical destabilizing potential. This is where scores can be settled, wrongdoing laid bare, unflattering details and inconvenient facts aired in public. And there are, of course, many examples of memoirs being delayed or blocked by government, ostensibly to protect official secrecy. Nico Henderson was put under pressure not to publish his diaries. Jeremy Greenstock delayed publication of his book on Iraq by more than 10 years. Stella Rimington talks at length in Open Secret about her struggle to publish in the face of government resistance. However, even where memoirs explicitly court controversy, I would suggest that the author's ultimate aim is conservative, in the sense of wishing to defend the legitimacy of government institutions. And in some cases, this means defending them against the harm being done by politicians, by criticizing those politicians in public, and sometimes in the form of a memoir. This is very much an argument that I draw from Dennis's work, and I will leave it to him to say more about this trend towards greater outspokenness by former officials. But what I think we can take away more generally from my mini tour of diplomatic memoirs is the idea that this genre of writing about the past coexists with official history in a symbiotic relationship, which is, I think, despite differences of optic, style, and content, mutually reinforcing. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Helen. Lots of stuff to pick up on there, especially on the stabilizing, destabilizing question. And I think in the chat, a few of our listeners have put in some extra memoirs that you might not have had on your list. So do take a look at that. Dennis, do you want to move straight over to you? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Richard. Let me start by just sharing my screen so we get this rolling. Where is the... There it is. And then if I press presentation mode, can I just confirm that you're seeing that?
Yeah, we can see that.
Richard? Lovely, thank you. Well, I mean, let me start by saying thank you for the opportunity, and thanking Helen for leading our duo, our team of two. I've never previously been called a dream collaborator, so this is clearly something that we need to continue. And look, in my time today, I want to present two lines of argument to follow on essentially from Helen's points and interweave with them. The first is around the value of memoirs as a form of narrative memory that connects into forms of institutional memory within the Foreign Office, but also within the wider civil service. The second argument that follows from that is about wider changes in the governing environment within Westminster system democracies and how it is drawing senior civil servants and indeed diplomats more into the public gaze than we might traditionally be used to. And I want to try and unpack what that means for the impact of the memoirs that they release. So to turn to the first of those, from a political science point of view, what memoirs do is allow us access to the internal storytellers within our governing institutions. Who are our internal storytellers? They are the civil servants and the diplomats who try and make sense of changing policy and changing political reality by testing it against the scaffolding of the Westminster tradition and set of beliefs with which they are most familiar. So looking at memoirs allows us a different avenue to access and assess the individual actor that lies beyond the institutional line or take on an issue. We can, as scholars, apply what I've called a form of historical interpretivism to try and capture stories that would otherwise not be available to us. And what I'm showing on this slide is a piece I published 7 or 8 years ago now on this style of historical interpretivism to try and get at the interaction between what people see and the beliefs that they hold on what is important about the institutions they serve. And that then connects to some more contemporary work that I'm involved in across countries, trying to excavate institutional memory as a form of storytelling. So institutional memory is seen across many bureaucracies as being in decline due to changes in record keeping practices, due to turnover of staff, people churn, and digital innovation, amongst other factors. So what my colleagues and I are trying to do is reconceptualize institutional memory as more than simply documentary evidence and as something closer to a form of storytelling. And so this is a little book we published 3 or 4 years ago now, where we're trying to compare a static form of institutional memory, an objective truth that is waiting to be located and recovered in the form of a paper file or an electronic one, to something more dynamic, something more of a living thing that is passed through conversation. And through that conceptualization, memory becomes an act of interpretation, something generated by the engagement of actors with their surroundings through the lens of the traditions that they hold dear. Now, institutional memory is often about shaping internal narratives and passing tradition internally. What happens then if it takes on a more outward face? And that is what brings me then to my second line of argument that I want to connect to, which is the shift from this internal departmental world to a wider public stage. In the 21st century, internal narratives that might once have been passed down as a form of internal memory only are giving way to becoming contributions to debates in a wider public square, a wider public domain. And across countries governed by the Westminster system of government, I've argued that we are shifting from the traditions of governing in private to the realities of governing in public. So what do I mean by that? The traditional picture of the Westminster system in operation was one in which civil servants remained quietly in the background as the largely anonymous advisors of the government of the day. Ministers were the public face of government, and that is as it should be. And there's this wonderful quote that I'm showing you there from Peter Hennessy, Lord Hennessy, from a documentary that he was cited in a decade ago, that the traditional Whitehall Mandarin was scarcely a household name in their own household. Now, in that kind of environment, if former servants of the Crown wished to have public things to say through memoirs, government was intensely nervous about it. And that applied not just to high-level mandarins, but also officials. And so to give one example, we can turn to the spycatcher scandal of the 1980s, which many of you may remember. Now, I grew up in Tasmania in the 1980s, the island state at the bottom of Australia, which is why I sound this way. And I distinctly recall pictures of an old man in a hat appearing on the news regularly in the mid-1980s. That man was Peter Wright, and he lived less than an hour down the road from me in Tasmania's capital city of Hobart, and he lived in a sleepy little town called Cygnet. And what he did in Cygnet was write a sensationalist memoir of his time in the British security services. And as we know, the Thatcher government did not want that memoir to be published. So much so that it sent Robert Armstrong, the cabinet secretary, to Sydney to try desperately to block publication. And in court, as a little sideline, the opposing barrister, if you like, the person appearing on behalf of Wright's publishers, was Malcolm Turnbull, more recently one of Australia's prime ministers, who kind of devastated Robert Armstrong in the witness box and led him to make what has become a rather memorable phrase, if you like, that he had been economical with the truth, a phrase that has kind of entered Westminster folklore. But at the turn of this year, 2023-24, the cabinet papers from that period relating to Spycatcher were finally released, so that we can see up close the level of intense determination that this memoir should not be allowed to see the light of day. And of course, the Thatcher government rather spectacularly lost that argument in the courts. But so, this is a brief from that set of cabinet papers that was released. And you can just see in Margaret Thatcher's hand, the sort of scribbled comment in the bottom right-hand corner there, the consequences of publication would be enormous, MT. And indeed, the brief itself, and this is clearly not my underlining, so someone has helped us here with the highlighter, it captures well this sense of nervousness. If we look at the text, it may be that we shall not in the end prevent publication, but it is important to do all we can to prevent it, not least in order to deter other members and former members of the intelligence services from seeking to publish books. If published, Wright's book would attract great publicity and cause damage politically. It certainly did attract great publicity at the time, and not least, one could argue, because of the British government's attempts to prevent its publication. So fast forward to 15 years later, 2001, I think, and the Stella Rimington memoir that Helen has already mentioned. So we've moved from a scenario where the British government was willing to throw the kitchen sink at Peter Wright to prevent the publication of Spycatcher, by no means a senior leader in his organization, to a situation where the former head of MI5 was able to publish her autobiography. Now, of course, as Helen has outlined, that was in no way an easy process, but it is nonetheless a very different one when juxtaposed against the Peter Wright experience. And then we move to today, where if we look in the top right-hand corner, we have the Director General of MI5, Ken McCallum, delivering the Bowman Lecture at the University of Glasgow last year. So there was a time when the very names of the heads of our security services were a well-kept public secret. Now, not only is it not a secret, but those named individuals will step out in public and give very public speeches into the public domain. So in the bottom there, we've got the head of MI6, Sir Richard Moore, when he was talking in Prague about security challenges. So traveling overseas as the head of MI6 to give a degree of insight that I think in Thatcher's time would have caused some palpitations. So it's a sea change in the level of comfort with a more publicly facing profile. And that includes, at the same time, not just the security services, but also the diplomatic services. So, you know, I have there on the left an interview, a published interview with Karen Pierce, the UK ambassador to the USA, and social media has created a more outwardly facing public profile too. So I've taken just a screenshot there of the Twitter account of the current Permanent Undersecretary, Philip Barton, and 30,000 followers, my friends. There is many an academic that would kill for such a following. Quite the opposite to, let's say, the quietly anonymous Mandarin figures of old. But the broader issue that occurs is when a public face becomes a jarring public voice, when that greater public face leads to former diplomats being willing to present themselves as public figures in their own right, then we have the potential for conflict. Now, my Megaphone Bureaucracy book from a few years ago examined this across different Westminster countries in what I term this shift towards governing in public. And what I argue is that we are governing in newly public-facing ways in a new public square. There is some greater official comfort with that or acceptance of that, but the risks are also real, as they can lead to blame games that are carried out in public as well. And I cite in the book Lord Wilson, Richard Wilson, who was then Cabinet Secretary in 2002, when he gave a speech which was then published as Portrait of a Profession Revisited, where he talks about this shift. And let me read it out because I think it is significant. The public profile of civil servants is becoming more prominent. Our actions are becoming subject to greater public comment as if we were figures in our own right, rather than servants of the government. We have a strong gene against this. The trap is obvious. If permanent civil servants were to become public figures in a way which led Parliament and the media to look to them for their personal views and advice to ministers, as opposed to the policies and views of the government they serve, it is easy to imagine how loyalty and trust could be eroded. And there are many examples of this sort of warning, if you like, emerging or playing out around the Westminster world. Let me just share with you a couple. So on the left here, we have John Whitehead, who was Permanent Secretary equivalent at the New Zealand Treasury in the late noughties, is that what we call them, through to about 2011, I think, and was known for publicly speaking his mind whilst in office. And you know, the Treasury over which he presided would put out reports and information into the public domain sort of presented as a Treasury view that the government could then consider or not in its own decision making. Next to him, we have Canadian public servant Wayne Waters, who was clerk of the Privy Council under the Harper government in Canada. So that's the equivalent of our cabinet secretary here in the UK. And he was accused of being too close to the government of the day and in defending them against the Public Budget Office and officer in a way that some were alleging crossed a line, which is certainly something that Wayne Waters disputes. But the point is that once one starts acting in public and commenting in public, officials become public faces and become prone as a result to accusations of politicization, whether the actuality is politicization is there or not. So, for example, when Margaret Thatcher passed away, Bob Kerslake and Jeremy Haywood, pictured there with Francis Maude, wrote a personal reflection in a piece on the in the Daily Telegraph on what it was like to work with Margaret Thatcher at a personal level. They were accused by a Labor MP of having, quote, prostituted their neutrality, unquote, in writing this piece and in reflecting on Margaret Thatcher. And it became, you know, at least a low-level furor that they then had to deal with. On the right-hand side is a still from the 2013 Australian election campaign, when the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury in Australia publicly rebuked the Prime Minister during an election campaign for claiming that public servants had costed opposition policies and found a financial black hole. He said, essentially, he put out a press release saying, no, we did not, publicly contradicting his Prime Minister. Now, that same type of contestation of civil servants becoming public figures then feed through to public figures feeling that they legitimately have the right to say things, to set records straight through memoirs when they retire. Which brings us then to our diplomats. And Helen has already mentioned the Maya memoir, ambassador to Washington under the Blair administration, ended up in a distinct series of rows with members of that government over his rather unflattering assessments of the way, you know, certain individuals had conducted themselves. And yet, that memoir also provided a wonderful set of insights for historians and political scientists to engage with. So the question then becomes, is there a line here that we need to consider? And what would it look like if it was crossed? And the same kind of discussion has then emerged more recently in Simon Lord Macdonald's case. So he published this book that Helen just showed you a couple of years ago, I think now. And of course, as a published memoir, it draws public and media comment. And with public comment comes public controversy. Internal narratives become public narratives once former civil servants emerge as figures in their own right, to use Lord Wilson's phrase. So this is an interesting development and places diplomats as part of a wider shift from governing in private to governing in public. So they fit within the same series of events, if you like, the same conceptual changes that are occurring for other senior civil servants. So let me move things towards a close. So the shifting conditions of modern governance mean that civil servants, including diplomats, are increasingly governing in public as a 24/7 news media combined with a hyper-partisan political environment to drive a tendency towards public blame games. And under these conditions, the diplomatic memoir offers an opportunity to its authors for a kind of third act, a contribution to the public square that is intended to start a public conversation. And perhaps before I move to, I don't know what happened. Have I ejected myself there? Let me re-emerge. I beg your pardon. Let me read you a couple of quotes to sort of illustrate our conundrum. So the first is from somebody called William Seidman, who was a US bureaucrat who wrote a memoir in 1993 on the savings and loan scandals in the US of the late 1980s. And he wrote at the start of his memoir, "I share the goals of most memoirists to immortalize my contribution to society, to even scores with my enemies, to provide financial security for my old age, and to confirm the taxpayers' worst suspicions about their government, and generally leave a record of my adventures for the benefit of future historians." Exhibit. The second quote is the rather more measured words of the Public Administration Committee of the House of Commons, who produced a report in 2006 into the publication of memoirs, following on from the Meyer publication. And they said this: "Memoirs and diaries tell us a great deal about the workings of government. They are a source of interest to the general reader, valuable for the citizen, and a resource for future historians. On the other hand, ill-judged and instant memoirs can undermine that confidentiality and erode the trust which is necessary for ministers, officials, and advisors to work together." Unquote. And therein is our conundrum of the memoir that is providing so much, but also comes with risks attached. So as a final wrap up across the two contributions from Helen and I, we've argued that the diplomatic memoir offers us perspectives that official history may find difficult to access. And as Helen has shown, they access areas of diplomatic life and an emotional canvas that official history is rarely able to touch in the same way. It's a rich social insight that peels back an extra layer beyond the established traditions of Foreign Office working to reveal diplomats as fully formed individuals with social lives, families, and the capacity to emerge as public figures in their own right. This does not mean that memoirs are artifacts of revolution. The genre largely reflects the desire of individuals to defend and display affection for the nobility of diplomatic service rather than seeking to discredit it or overturn it. It is an exercise more in defense of tradition than in attack upon it. But in the very act of defending those traditions in public, civil servants and diplomats find themselves as contestants in the new public square amidst the cut and thrust of intensely political debates that they might once have sought to remain above. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. So if I now cease to share my screen, I should be back live, and I will hand you back to Richard. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dennis, and to Helen for two great presentations. I've got the sun coming in on one side of me here, so I'm kind of half in shadow. But if anybody has any questions that they want to come in with, either put them in the chat or just put up your hand, and I can bring you in and we can get the conversation started. whilst people are thinking about questions, maybe I can kick off with the first one. And I was just interested, Dennis, in this idea of the static and the dynamic institutional memory, because to me, the static memory, if it's a document, is fixed. And even though people can interpret the document in different ways, the document itself is fixed. Whereas with the the more dynamic institutional memory, presumably that's constantly shifting. And if people are passing down information to others, there's a kind of Chinese whisper, and one step removed each time it moves on. So is there a danger there in relying on this kind of dynamic institutional memory rather than the static? Or is it more of a complementary thing rather than one over the other? Just any thoughts you had on that?
Richard, thank you. An excellent question. And I guess what we argue is that institutional memory in reality is document plus interpretation. And if there is this sort of view about the decline of institutional memory, that there was once a golden age when files were and could be regularly accessed, and we could sort of get hold of the truth, as it were. And I think what we're arguing is essentially the sort of the paper file is an artifact that is brought to life by the way that actors choose to engage with it. So, in some of the interviews we did for that small book, we were struck by the fact that people who had worked on something, even 2 or 3 years ago, had either forgotten about it, and so would start each new policy process from scratch, or to the extent that they remembered it, would not then go and seek the file. So in a sense, you need both the file, the good filing system, and the capacity to unlock it and bring it to life. And in the process, we sort of argue that there are stories attached to the file, as in, oh yes, that was a disaster. The next Treasury civil servant that wanders in and says, I think we should have a poll tax, is confronted by a series of memories of the poll tax as a disaster that moves around and beyond simply the artifact of the paper file. So there's something about the relationship between the two, but you are quite right that we are not, you're quite right to warn that we should not think of memory as, the art of storytelling alone, because I agree, I think that leads us into more dangerous waters.
But of course, that presupposes that the paper file exists, and we've now moved into an era of digital records where paper files don't exist. So sometimes, perhaps, the dynamic institutional memory is the only thing that exists, and so that's the only thing that we have to rely on. Philip, I see you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, please. For both Helen and Dennis, so excellent presentations, and I just wanted to sort of draw you out on a particular theme that emerges from both of your presentations. Okay, there might not have been a golden age of collective memory, but was there a golden age of secrecy? And when does it end? And I'm thinking of works like David Vincent's 1998 book, Culture of Secrecy. So the idea that there is a kind of a cultural norm within the civil service, and that if you went to the right school, you went to the right university, you know what the limits are of what you can say publicly. And writing a memoir, in the way that not just Stella Rimington, but say Percy Sillitoe did in the 1950s, another former head of MI5, wasn't that it was giving away any state secrets, so far as Whitehall was concerned. It was just in very bad taste, and the sort of thing you would expect from someone who hadn't gone to a very good school. So that there are these powerful cultural norms operating, which presuppose that it is better not to publicly, reveal things in the form of memoirs. And that's not to say that there's absolute secrecy. I mean, you know, one of the reasons that the case against Peter Wright fails is that, you know, many of Wright's colleagues are leaking like sieves to Chapman Pynchon and Rupert Allison, but you don't do it personally. You don't give the sort of personal authority in public to those revelations. So can you see, in your work, do you see that kind of culture of secrecy at work? And when does it break down? Are you talking about a kind of breakdown in the 80s or 90s of that culture? And why does it happen?
Which of us should, would you?
You go first, Dennis.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you for another great question, Philip. So I think those cultural norms, I see them everywhere. And even in research interviews with some of the older civil servants, you know, and even in, you know, not just in the UK, but in Canada, I remember strikingly some insisting that they believe in the traditions of Westminster, and for them that equates to a quiet anonymity, and they are not a public figure, and they do not wish to become a public figure. And you're right that is embedded so much in the cultural life of the institution. It is a part of the kind of good chaps theory of government. If we think about Hennessy, you know, is that those sound people know that you don't share things in public. And, you know, even in Lord Wilson's observation there, you sense even at that point, so that's 2002, a desire to pull back against this improper trend, if you like, that is emerging into light. I trace, or I make the argument, let's say, that what is happening is that the environment, the governing environment, is shifting around those cultural norms. And as a result, the norms are slowly being tested and probably eroded as a result. So, you know, they've run into the reality of 24/7 news cycle, hyper-partisan political environments, select committees willing to, you know, push and pull people more into the public domain, sort of testing, you know, freedom of information, testing the culture of secrecy as it was instituted, and kind of pulling sufficiently at it that we have the old culture trying to hold on in the face of new governing realities. But let me stop talking, pass to Helen.
Yeah, I think what interests many diplomats, you know, want to write. You didn't get to see for very long on my slideshow. Kind of shows is this sense of a tradition, that writing a memoir is actually quite a legitimate thing to do, if you are a diplomat. And so a lot of diplomats clearly, and I think there's something also about diplomats, you know, many of them sort of, you know, are writers, and they, you know, they want to write, and many of them actually go on in their retirement to write lots and lots of books on all sorts of subjects. So I think there's a kind of literary kind of element to the memoir writing, which we should keep in mind. But I think, I think the kind of the norms over what you write in your memoir, in a sense, this is actually why the Meyer autobiography was so explosive in 2005, because there was a sense that he had broken with the tacit understandings about what you write and, you know, what you do and you don't say in your memoir. So I mean, Nico Henderson, when he publishes his diaries as Mandarin in, I think, 1994, and he originally wants to get them published much sooner, and it's blocked by the cabinet secretary. And in his oral history interview at Churchill, he sort of talks about how indignant he was by the suggestion that somehow he didn't know, or he couldn't be trusted to public, to self-censor and to take out anything that would be damaging to official secrecy or to to the future of ministerial trust. So there's a sense that although I'm going ahead and publishing, but of course you can trust me to abide by the rules. So I think that's definitely that's in the 1990s. So I think the sense that writing a memoir is a fairly sort of normal thing for a diplomat to want to do, but the question is, can you trust them to say, to self-censor in terms of what they actually put in their memoir?
Yeah, and sometimes censoring for the national interest and censoring for institutional reputation are often not necessarily the same thing. But we've got a question. You're just RNW1, so please come in and ask.
I've never worked out how to change that to Neville Wiley or anything remotely to who I am. Anyway, thank you very much, Helen and Dennis, for some really interesting papers, very thought-provoking. I've just got a couple of sort of questions. The first is that the individuals we're talking about, whether they're Canadian or Australian that we've mentioned, or British, they're all part of that Westminster model of representing a civil service in a way that you wouldn't get in the United States because of the way they clear things out. So I wonder if you'd like to reflect on that. To what extent is this a British phenomenon or a Westminster phenomenon? And I was thinking particularly on your paper, Helen, do we see similar outpourings of ambassadorial memoirs or diplomatic service memoirs in other countries? And I don't think you do quite, but maybe in France a bit. So it might be a sort of imperial thing. And of course, there's no point having a memoir of a Swiss minister because they're not occupying the same roles as your British ones. So that's the first question. Is it a sort of Westminster thing or an imperial thing? The second aspect, though, is going into the sort of diplomatic side, because ambassadors, and this point you made about the literary aspect of it, Helen, they are, as it were, head of house, aren't they? They're head of they have a public role in the capitals to whom they're accredited, and in a way that you don't if you're kind of head of the Treasury or head of the Home Office or whatever. So is there something distinctive about the diplomatic side of things? And that got me thinking about sort of Paul Sharp's work around a diplomatic tradition and the sort of diplomatic core. And to what extent are these individuals in their writing not just reflecting on their position and within a sort of Mandarin Whitehall kind of context, but also representative of, the diplomatic world that connects them as diplomats to other people in the diplomatic services of other countries? And I wonder whether you see that in their memoirs. So just some thoughts on that would be really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I confess I haven't thought enough about that comparative question that you asked at the beginning, and I know that Dennis perhaps can say a bit more about US memoirs, which do exist, but I think you're right that they aren't quite the same, perhaps, as and I think there is something quite British or distinctly British about this tradition of autobiographical writing. I think you're really right that diplomats clearly seem to want to write memoirs more readily than other kinds of civil servants. There are civil servants who write memoirs, but they're fairly few and far between. And I think there are several elements here. I think one is the connection that I mentioned briefly with travel writing. So I think that sense that you can tell a really good story about traveling all around the world and different places. Some diplomats really go in for the thick description of the places that they're posted to, very kind of evocative of place. So I think that aspect of it, that there's something that's just more interesting for the reader when you've got a career that's taken you around the world. And I think also that point about diplomacy being a more kind of closed culture, being a sort of more a kind of distinctive part of government service where there is a very strong professional identity. And you're right, a lot of the memoirs are talking about this sort of tight-knit world in foreign capitals where they're socializing with diplomats from other countries, and there's a particular set of traditions and practices and rituals which their memoirs can sort of detail and document and reconstruct. So I think that is something that makes the diplomatic memoir distinctive from any from a civil servant memoir, and helps to explain, I think, why we have so many of these things.
And to perhaps add to that, then on the first part of your question, I think what is perhaps more unique, if that is in fact a viable term, to the Westminster world is the sense of cultural disquiet that we've been discussing already. The sort of sense of knowing your place in the Westminster system. I think that level of disquiet is less in evidence in the US, for example, because exactly as you say, we have a system where we have thousands of political appointees coming in with every new administration, and there is, I think, more of an expectation of direct accountability for those appointees in a way that does not necessarily yet flow in our Westminster system, where ministerial responsibility still holds sway, as under challenge though it sometimes is. And so part of that is being a more public figure. And I think it's almost, I'm going too far here, but it's almost a rite of passage in the US that after you've served, you write about it. I'm thinking of, there are hardly any members of the Trump administration who have not written a memoir about their time in the Trump administration. And, they're wonderful ways to shed light on what is happening in the internal world of government, and yet don't show that sense of cultural disquiet that still underpins the kind of debate we have in this country about, Simon MacDonald's memoir or Christopher Myers' memoir.
Patrick, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I have. Thanks. Well, first of all, thank you, both Dennis and Helen. So many thoughts provoked by your presentations, but just a couple of initial ones, perhaps. I was thinking about the distinction between diplomatic diaries and diplomatic memoirs, and it's a personal thing, really, but I much prefer a diary to a memoir. The Cadogan diaries, for instance, from the Second World War, absolute classic. And I'd much rather read those than any memoir that Cadogan might ever have written. And I think the same would be true of Nico Henderson. But and that leads me to another thought, really, and that is that diaries are technically, I think, prohibited still. I don't think civil servants are supposed to keep diaries, yet I think probably nearly all of them did or have done and still do. And that leads to the point about the whole question of sensitivity review of memoirs and of diaries, because all of these people have signed the Official Secrets Act, and all of them are required to submit their publications for sensitivity review. And nearly all of them do, of course, but that whole process of review is very interesting, and you don't see it on the outside mostly. It takes place internally. I noticed, for instance, that Simon MacDonald was criticised in that article that Dennis showed for not submitting his book to the Cabinet Office. Well, I don't think he was supposed to. I think he was supposed to submit it to the Foreign Office. I don't know whether he did or not, but there is that distinction. And I remember at the time when I joined the Foreign Office in 2003, so the Mayor thing was really big at that time and highly controversial. And people in the office were very miffed that he'd bypassed the Foreign Office and gone to the Cabinet Office. That was their line, because the Cabinet Office wasn't as vigilant on such things as the Foreign Office was, so they're extremely fed up. But the ultimate point is that since Spycatcher, Dennis, you mentioned that, since Spycatcher, British government has recognised that it's impossible to enforce the Official Secrets Act as far as memoirs are concerned. And again, one of these sort of anecdotes that I remember from when I first joined, shortly before I joined, they'd had to look at Percy Craddock's book. It's called In Pursuit of British Interests. I've actually got it here. A really sensible book. It's not sensationalist. It's really thoughtful about what foreign policy was like in the Thatcher era. And they hated this book. And they tried to do everything they could to stop it. And they realized they couldn't. So the only sanction they had was, oh, we won't invite Sir Percy to any more diplomatic receptions. I think that was the line. Well, this is just pathetic. But it shows that, government, maybe Dennis is right, maybe these things are less sensitive now, but, government has been extremely, edgy about this sort of thing. And stupidly, I think. Those are just my anecdotal reflections. No great thoughts. Thanks very much.
I mean, thank you, Patrick, very much. And as an Australian, I have no expectation of being invited to such things at all, memoir or not. But yeah, fascinating, isn't it? And that comment about the people in the FO or the FCDO being miffed if you go outside the organisation for your getting your memoir read and processed and checked. There's this sort of, it's an interesting cultural insight in itself, that there's something about, you play within your team, whether you wish to publish something or not. It's for us to engage with it as your peers rather than for the Cabinet Office. That's really interesting. I will think on that.
I just think it's sort of interesting, that point about, what kind of loyalty or affective bond might sort of exist between the former official and the institution. And again, this is something that I was sort of interested in as I was sort of reading these memoirs. I think most of them do exude a kind of affection for the service. And I mean, some of them are explicitly, writing because they want to express their gratitude, to the Foreign Office for a wonderful career. I mean, I guess the ones perhaps who didn't feel that way wouldn't write the memoir. Or, and it's similar also in the oral history, the diplomatic oral history program at Churchill. Again, a lot of these interviewees are talking about, their very kind of strong sense of attachment and identification with the office. And I think that that's a sort of interesting dynamic also to think about in relation to memoirs. And perhaps again might be why the Meyer book was so problematic. I mean, he'd somewhat fallen out, I think, with the Foreign Office before he left, I think. So yeah, I mean, so again, this kind of question about settling scores. The memoir is a place that you settle scores.
There's a comment which kind of picks up on what we've just been discussing here. For ambassadors, there's also the tradition of the valedictory dispatch, which could be the first cut at a memoir. And it reminded me that particularly in the 20th century, lots of ministers and diplomats would often write to the Foreign Office saying, can I see papers that, on issues that I was involved in at the time, so that I can refresh my memory, so that when I'm writing my memoir, I can, get the story straight. And so I suppose there's a relationship there between the department and the memoir writer. And I think Eyre Crowe, I've just dug out a quote from when one of these requests came in. He said that it would be useful to let the truth be known under conditions which we can to some extent control. So there's this idea that, the department has the documents and the memoir writer wants to refresh his memory. And so there's a kind of give and take there as to what eventually will be written. But we've got another question from Tony McNulty. Do you want to come in, Tony, and ask your question? Or I can just read it out. There you are. We can't hear you, Tony, although it looks as though you're not muted. No, still can't hear you. Should I just read your question out? All right. He says, is there any value in ministerial memoirs diaries, or are they self-serving, bland, and highly selective, as Gamble would have it? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, well, let me start. My reaction would be, I think it's possible to be both. What was the exact quote you were using there? Tony,
bland and highly selective.
Indeed. I suspect they in fact are exactly all of those things, and that Gamble is quite right. And yet at the same time, that does not make them useless to us as either historians or political scientists. There is something, even in the bland and even in the self-serving, there is something about the nature of politics, the nature of public service that I think comes through. That's what I would argue.
Yeah, I would agree. Often they are all of those things, but they can be all of those things in quite interesting ways for the historian. And I think, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, maybe the lower level official. I mean, some of the diplomats, some of the unpublished memoirs. Like I said, they're kind of full of these little nuggets of insight, or just kind of little kind of precious jewels that just suddenly kind of make the past live, or make the institution live. And you have to kind of dig around for them, but then they will get there. And I think sometimes the writer may not even realize that they're saying something really quite revealing or telling about institutional culture. But if you read, reading against the grain, or if you're looking for kind of particular things, they kind of jump out of the page. So that's why I love these kinds of sources. They might seem quite mundane and bland, but then, someone will write something that's incredibly interesting and tells you a lot.
Philip, did you want to come back in?
Oh yeah, just on that very point. Over 30 years later, I still remember the sheer delight of getting my hands on this in 1993 in W.H. Smith's in Paddington, getting on the train and starting to read it. And I wonder, Helen, if it had, this, as I say, it was 1993 it came out. I wonder whether it made it more difficult to hold the line against Nico Henderson's diaries, which come out in 95 after Clarke had written this, because it really sets a new standard for indiscretion about the workings of government, and indeed sort of indiscreet comments about the civil servants who worked with Clarke. I wonder whether it was a bit of a game changer.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, it's so interesting to think about autobiographical writing, whether it's a diary or a memoir, as a genre which is dynamic and evolving. And actually, the parameters of what you can or can't say are always changing. And the tradition is reinventing itself all the time, and setting new norms. So I think that's really, yeah, I'm sure that the co-location of those two texts is significant, as you suggest, Philip.
Patrick, do you want to come back in again?
Yes, I wasn't going to, but just this has prompted a whole new set of thoughts, really. But we must remember that much of this debate about what could be published and what can't be published started with Richard Crossman, the Crossman diaries in the 70s. And the Radcliffe rules, which were then brought in, are the ones that govern ministerial memoirs, which are separate from the rules that govern the memoirs of civil servants. But they overlap, I think. There's similar sort of criteria. And looking back at Crossman, what was wrong with Crossman? I mean, now it seems remarkably, helpful, frank, and so on. But in that time, it was obviously deemed far too open. Again, it shows how things have changed. But actually, the rules that are established at that time technically are still valid, I believe. Thank you.
We've got a question here from Marilyn. To what extent do you think that ghostwriters may be used for memoirs, and the influence this might have on what's presented? Any thoughts on that? I'd have thought that most diplomats, if there's one thing that they do well, it's write, and so they would want to write their own rather than have them ghostwritten, but maybe for ministers it's a different thing. I don't know whether you've come across any ghostwritten memoirs in the Whitehall sphere.
I mean, I would have to admit it is not something I have thought about or looked at. I make this exactly the same assumption that if you are a former civil servant or a diplomat, you will want to be writing every word of this. Whereas I could imagine elements of ghostwriting in some of our, let's say, more senior ministerial memoirs. But I must confess, I don't know.
I'm going to chip in again. I mean, yes, I think with senior politicians, they're always ghostwritten virtually, as far as I can see. I know that the one thing I do know a little bit about is the Thatcher memoirs, which were virtually all compiled by research assistants, very, very good ones actually, because as Charles Moore said in his biography of Thatcher, she had no interest in history at all. You know, it just did nothing. She didn't even understand it, I don't think. But she sort of put her hand to what other people had written. But I do know, I mean, I won't mention the name, I do know one diplomat whose memoirs were ghostwritten by quite a historian, quite a well-known younger historian, who quite a few of us here around actually know, but I better not say who it was. Thank you.
You've left us all hanging there, Patrick.
I'll tell you, Richard, later on.
Yeah, exactly. We're almost at time, but does anybody else have any final questions that they want to ask? I often wonder, this is just an aside, on the role that pensions play in diplomatic memoirs, because pensions, or the denial of the pension, is often the kind of sword of Damocles which hangs over diplomats who write memoirs that are maybe deemed, too insensitive. But on the other hand, the denial of a pension to somebody is a reason why they write a memoir. You know, to get back at the government and to supplement their income. You know, with a juicy memoir. So, you know, the humble pension is a player in the memoir game, but maybe that's for further research at some future point. Any more questions before we wrap up? Well, I just want to say then thank you both to Helen and to Dennis for two great papers that have provoked, I think, what has been a really interesting discussion. And, it's a great contribution to the seminar series as a whole. So thanks to you both for taking the time to take part in the series. And I just want to say again, our next seminar is on the 6th of June. So please do join us in 3 weeks' time for the next seminar. But for now, I just want to say thanks to everybody for attending and for taking part. And have a great evening, everybody. So thanks all.